Hello and welcome to today's Info Security Magazine webinar. My name's Dan Raywood, I'm the Deputy Editor of Info Security Magazine, and I'll be moderating today's event in association with Lloyd's Register. So for the next hour we're going to be looking at the popular subject of ISO 27001. We're going to be saying that quite a lot over the next 60 minutes, and particularly leveraging ISO 27001 to manage cyber and information security risks. It's a very popular framework, one that a lot of people probably listening to today have probably heard of. Maybe you're looking to implement it, maybe you already have and you're trying to sort of figure out how you can remain compliant with it. Well, hopefully we'll be covering all those subjects for you today, and you can get a lot of takeaways on the this very popular framework and compliance, which we're going to figure out exactly if it's framework or compliance. So we'll be covering that in the next hour. So as I said, we're going to be running throughout the hour, so please do join in with those as and when they appear. If you have questions, I'm sure we're going to see some today. Do let us know. Use the questions option just below the main screen, and obviously we'll try to delegate those to the right people if they are for a specific presenter. If you're on Twitter, hashtag InfoSecWebinar, and we're at InfoSecurityMag if you want to tweet us. And if you want to just sort of share any thoughts, we'll try and share some thoughts as we go along. And if you're a member of ISC Squared, EC Council or ISARCA, you can gain 1 CPE credits based on a minimum attendance of 50 minutes, 50 minutes. Once you've done that, download your certificate from your Info Security account and submit it. There's instructions in the attachments on how to do that. If this is your first webinar with us, you've been prompted to enter your CPE number at registration. If you did not, and you would like to get us credit for attending this session, then please log out and then come back in. We're about literally 2 minutes in, so if you log out, come back in the next sort of 8-9 minutes. We're probably going to run for about an hour, so you'll have plenty of time to catch that 50 minutes, that 50 minutes, which will qualify you for a credit, because CPE credits cannot be created retrospectively. And also, please note, CPE certificates will be processed within about 48 hours. Don't kind of expect it to drop in immediately. It not really the way it works. It'll sort of turn around after a while, and if you're watching on demand, it might take a couple of days, so do give it time to turn around. So with that, let's move on and introduce our speakers today. So I'm Dan from Info Security. I'd like to be joined by Rob Acker. Rob is Quality Manager for Information Security and Business Continuity at Lloyd's Register. Chris Oakley, who is VP Technical Services for the Americas at Nettitude, and Gopalakrishnan Curry, who is Global Service Management Systems Manager at Motorola. A couple of good long job titles in there, which I struggle to fit into this slide, but big thanks to Rob, Gopalakrishnan and Chris Oakley for joining us today on this webinar. And let's move on and introduce the first poll question. So what is your organisation's status with regards to ISO 27001? I'm going to, all different ways, 2701, 2701. There's lots of different ways to say it, but I think you're going to figure out what we're talking about there. I think we've got iOS, I should have said ISO. That's me working. ISO 27001 is what it says on the poll question there. It's the same thing. I think we're talking about the right thing. Is it certified, planning to become certified, or undecided? One of those three. Which one are you? Maybe you're kind of thinking about it. You're already doing it, you're unsure. Well, do let us know. We're going to leave that poll running for the first sort of duration of this talk, the first presenter, excuse me. And that is Chris Oakley, who is VP Technical Services Americas at Nettitude. So Chris, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I thought it would be useful to start off by looking at the threat landscape, okay? So we want to look at what sort of threats exist out there. And the slide that you're looking at, most threats exist somewhere on this spectrum. And of course, in the real world, it's a little bit messier than this. It doesn't fit perfectly along a spectrum, and there might even be types of threat that don't exist in this diagram. But it gives you a sort of general sense of what it is that we're dealing with out there. So at the bottom, you can see you've got your more unsophisticated threat actors. So I think your sort of script kiddies, maybe hacktivists, people that don't have, or groups that don't have access to a whole lot of resources typically. And then as we step up through the diagram, we get more towards that sort of nation states and nation state affiliated type of tier. And typically they have very specific objectives. They have a lot of resources, and it's the end of the diagram that, rightfully or wrongfully, a lot of people tend to worry about. I would say wrongfully. So we might find that a script kiddie is going to just scan the internet, looking for whatever low-hanging fruit that they can find and exploit it. whereas at the nation-state level, you're probably going to find that they're after specific people's personal information or intellectual property, that kind of thing. Now, I came across this report from the World Economic Forum. It was very recently released, links in the slides that you can go and have a look at afterwards. It was really interesting. It was specifically with regards to internet service providers, this report, and they called out a couple of key areas as very, very current and present threats. And those areas are social engineering and denial of service. And probably not a huge surprise to hear that those two areas are cropping up for ISPs. And of course, I would argue it's not just ISPs, but sort of broader industries as well. A couple of interesting statistics though. 32% of data breaches included phishing. Now, if you'd have asked me, I would have said that that number would have been an awful lot higher. And I think that can be attributed to the fact that it's often the more sophisticated end of the spectrum that deals with phishing emails. And then at the bottom where we're looking for that aforementioned low-hanging fruit, those are probably abusing technology more than people. And of course, 85% of organisations have reported some sort of phishing attempts. Again, kind of surprised that wasn't closer to 100%. But clearly, social engineering and all their guises, whether it's over the phone, over email, or even physically, is something that we need to be thinking about when we're threat modelling. The FBI, as you can see there, has estimated over $1 billion worth of loss on an annual basis due to business email compromise, and we have to help a lot of people who have fallen victim to that sort of compromise on a fairly regular basis. Of course, denial of service attacks are often forgotten about us, but they're very important. If your availability is materially impacted, it could be serious dollar cost. So the statistic that the World Economic Forum came up with was around about $250,000 per denial of service attack on average is what it tends to cost your average ISP. And in a peak denial of service attack, up to 25% of a given country's traffic may be to do with that attack. So these are pretty big numbers, and something that we want to keep in the back of our mind as we go through this. Go back one. So to get more specific, who are these groups that are targeting us? Well, we're always thinking about APT. We've got. I should point out that attribution is hard, by the way. So the word suspected is next to each one of these countries, and this is specific to telecoms targeting. And you can see it's China, unknown, probably China. China. When it's not China, it's Iran, and then sometimes it's Russia, except when it's China. So you can see that there's a lot of groups from a small number of countries, I should say, that are targeting telecoms. And if you go on the FBI website right now, you'll see that APT10 is actually in one of their most wanted lists. We'll come on to that in a little bit, but APT10 strongly suspected to be affiliated, at least, with the Chinese, have been involved in an ongoing telecommunications campaign. It's been going for a number of years, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. Insider threats are something I wanted to throw in there because people often forget, organizations often forget about the importance of insider threats. So if you're a large organization, this is most certainly a threat that should be really a high priority in your threat model. I've put e.g. AT&T there, and again, I'll describe this in a little bit more detail in a moment because they fell victim to just that. It was an insider breach. The reasons for insiders doing what they do, it could be that they're a disgruntled employee. It could be that they're being coerced on some level, potentially blackmailed, or it could even be, as was the case with AT&T, a simple case of bribery. But these insiders, your own employees, they're already in a position of privilege. They're somewhere that often is not highly prioritized on the threat model, and we've seen lots and lots of real-world breaches happen because an internal employee was allowed to go rogue. So, some recent breaches. I'm not going to go on about these at length. These days, it's barely newsworthy when a big breach hits the news. I remember when I first started in this industry, it was quite something when a breach made its way to mainstream news. These days, it seems like it's every week. But I thought I'd throw a few in there, not just telecoms, but broader industries as well. Facebook just right towards the tail end of last year, there was a security researcher called Bob Diachenko, and he discovered an open database on the dark web, and it contained 267 million records of various bits of Facebook data. Vietnam was suspected as possibly behind that, but again, attribution is hard, so we won't say that's for certain. Of course, Facebook's a huge organisation with a massive multi-million-dollar security program, so it's still able to fall victim to this sort of thing. We'll all be familiar with T-Mobile. There was, that again, tail end of last year, big breach, 1 million records. Capital One, of course, really hit the news last year. 100 million records from Capital One, of course, AT&T, as I've just mentioned, 2 million records. Now, the AT&T one was particularly interesting because there was an outsider bribing a group of insiders to at first unlock loads of phones. So, it was at least hundreds of thousands of mobile devices that were being unlocked so that you could use them anywhere in the world on any network. And of course, that has a dollar value associated with it. And then one by one, this inside group either left or started to become found out. And the outsider was left with just one person on the inside to bribe, and so they pivoted from just unlocking phones to compromising infrastructure so that they could do that themselves remotely. Insider threat, really something that I want to keep repeating to you and for you to hold in the back of your mind. You'll have seen as well, I'm sure, in the news just in the last few days that the US have just charged 4 Chinese military officers over the Equifax breach. Probably that's never going to come to anything unless they happen to leave China. But you can see that it's been taken very seriously on a state level. So, Operation Soft Cell, what is it? There's a lot of coordinated and sustained attacks that tend to happen. These are attacks that have an overall objective. They tend to target a given industry. So in the case of Operation Soft Cell, it was the telecommunications industry. This was an operation strongly suspected to be APT-10, the group I mentioned earlier that referenced on the FBI website. Strongly, their tactics, techniques, and procedures were strongly consistent with that group. They've been targeting Western, in particular Western telecommunications organizations since at least 2012, possibly longer. This was picked up by Cyber Reason. They did some really good research. I'd highly recommend you go and check it out. I've put a link in the slides. You can go and have a look afterwards. And the attacks were persistent. They came in waves. They included AT&T and T-Mobile and a number of other organizations. They included ISPs as well. They would get discovered on a given network. They would be contained, evicted, and then they'd be back a couple of months later. And that's where the persistent element of these sort of more nation-state type threats comes in. So if that's what's been going on in the last few months, what's the response to some of these threats? Now, there's been all sorts of frameworks, regulations, laws that have cropped up in response. The NCSC, which is the cybersecurity arm of GCHQ over in the UK, they've released a big paper that you should definitely go and read, security analysis for the UK telecom sector, although I would strongly suggest that a lot of the findings there would be just as applicable to other Western organisations, other Western countries. We've seen schemes such as T-Best come into being. T-Best is threat intelligence-led red teaming. So we're not going in as penetration testers and just trying to find all the vulnerabilities, but rather we're taking a measured approach. We're trying to emulate real-world threats. So you start with a threat intelligence portion of the exercise. That might say, hey, APT-10 as the relevant example is targeting you, Mr. ISP, and we're going to emulate their TTPs. We would then pass that information over to the red team. The red team would have specific objectives that they're trying to act on, and they would try and get as far into that attack chain as they can without the blue team detecting or responding. And it really is about exercising the blue team. So we've seen a lot of this sort of activity cropping up these days in response to some of these threats. And then another example, we've just seen version 1 of the CMMC come out as well here in the US. So, this is going to apply to anyone that exists in the DoD supply chain. That's not just defense contractors directly, but also their suppliers. And, it's estimated that 250 to 300,000 organizations are in scope initially for that, and they're phasing that in between now and 2026. And the thing I like about that is that there's 5 tiers of compliance, if you like. So tier 1 is just your basic cybersecurity hygiene. That's going to be applicable to organizations that are seen as low risk, low impact. Those organizations are probably just going to have to demonstrate that they've got relevant antivirus and their patching policy exists and then everything's up to date. It's all that kind of stuff. All the way up to tier 5, which is going to be that really robust, probably threat intelligence-led pen testing work, demonstration of a robust incident response plan and capability, demonstration of a threat intelligence capability. These are going to be for your probably Raytheons and whatnot of the world. Obviously, they're going to be held to a really high degree of assurance. And of course, there's a whole lot more besides that. I just thought I'd cherry pick a few of the schemes we're seeing. So all of this might be really overwhelming. Where do you start? Well, you start at the start. So you need to have a well-defined security program. You need a program that has clear objectives, that has timeframes and deadlines, and you need to have a way to measure those objectives, and it needs to be regularly measured. It can't just be a set of paper that you sort of write on and then file away in some dusty cabinet only to pull out the next year. It has to be something that you actively work on and live by as an organisation. And I would suggest, in fact, I think we would all suggest that a robust information security management system, or even a privacy information management system as well these days, they're two things that we really need to start thinking about as foundational. Now, foundational doesn't mean basic, it just means something that we should be thinking about from the start. If we get strong foundations, then we can worry about things like threat intelligence-led red teaming and flexing the blue team and all that sort of stuff. But we need to make sure that we have that foundation there to start off with. So that brings us to the end of my section. I'm going to pass back over to Dan for a poll.
Lovely, thank you very much, Chris. I'm going to get that going right now. I've stopped the first vote. Excuse me. Thanks very much for all of you who voted that, and that's literally the one you can see on your screen right now. As Chris was saying, the threat landscape doesn't get any easier. Things get worse and worse, and you see the size of the breaches there. You see, like you said, I saw the indictment this week around Experian, and we do see lots and lots of things going wrong, and it is a tricky one. And the simple question, as you can see on your screen right now, would you know if your company has had a cyber attack? The simple yes, no, or uncertain. Do share your thoughts on that. Again, just to sort of reiterate, some people listen to this and they might think, I don't want to admit a breach that I haven't told my regulator yet or my shareholders. We can't see people, we can just see numbers. Literally all we can see are the numbers of people, the percentages actually, the number of people voting, the percentages based on which of the three. So don't worry, we won't be recording anything, we won't be announcing, disclosing. We do responsible disclosure here. So do vote in that, and we are going to come back to the results of that one. Just to let you know quickly on the first vote then, we will you might be interested to know how many people are actually what level you're at. So 42% of you are actually uncertain whether you're certified or planning to become certified. 33% were certified, 23% planning to become certified. So if you put the sort of two top ones together, that's 56 certified or planning to become certified, and then another 42, so probably sort of 2% loss somewhere. But big thanks to all of you for voting. So that second poll is now open, as I said, and we will hand into our second speaker, who is Rob Acker from Lloyd's Register. So Rob, I'll hand over to you.
Many thanks, Dan. Thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you to Chris for setting the scene. It's certainly a complex and scary world out there, and we need all the help we can to try and live in that environment and to live a successful business. So what I'm hoping to share with you over the next few minutes is my thoughts as a practicing 27001 auditor, as well as a technical manager at Lloyd's Register. I'm going to focus primarily on what I would say is at the heart of the information security management system, the process and the principles behind risk management. I'm not going to go into it in a huge amount of depth, but hopefully give you a flavour of why adopting a management system that's compliant with 27001 is a good thing to do. Whether you go as far as allowing an independent body to come in and certify you, I'd always recommend that. You know, what have you got to hide, really? Let us be a friendly face, come in, challenge your system, and hopefully give you some insight into how good it is. So for me, risk management is at the heart of this security program that Chris mentioned. It really helps you to take all the best practice, whether it's the code of practice that's in the 27001 family, or whether it's the actual compliance standard itself, and use that to really help you put in place a framework that gets your whole business working together to help protect the information assets that you hold dear. It does give you both the opportunity to look at it both positively as well as perhaps negatively. You know, opportunities where we're all in the business of trying to grow our businesses, and if we get those risks right, we can break into new markets, we can offer new products, and that gives us an opportunity to grow whilst trying to keep those costs low by making sure that things that we hadn't anticipated happening, like a data breach, don't happen. Risk is a very human thing. We talk about people having a risk appetite, we talk about people being risk averse, and I think for me, however we approach risk management to try and demonstrate 27001, we must never lose sight of the human factor. And certainly my experience as an auditor talking to organisations is that if you can bring a group of people together, irrespective of whether you use a tool, if you can bring a group of people together, you give yourself the best chance of keeping the risks well managed within your organisation. But at the same time, you need to be sensitive to what's going on in the outside world, and 27001 is a great framework for enabling you to implement that continual improvement cycle, and be sensitive to all of the sorts of things that Chris alluded to. You know, there's lots going on out there, and we need to make sure that our management system is alert to those and responding to those. At the same time, as being trying to be flexible, we do need an element of rigor, and a good system is a repeatable system, is an auditable system, is something that is providing you with regular insight into its performance. And so 27001 includes in it several requirements which really, I think, help you to do that. So let's just think a little bit more about what we mean here. So 27001 makes reference to a range of other standards. You've got ISO 31000, which is, you know, really best practice in terms of the generic risk, and it's really looking at risk as uncertainty and the management of uncertainty. And I think we have to recognise that is we're never going to get on top of this. It's a question of scale, and making sure that the things we're dealing with are the things that are going to have the greatest benefit to us as an organisation. And so, you know, we've got to make sure that that's a balanced approach. Chris talked a bit about the insider threat as well as the external, and we've got to say, well, why are we doing this? And ultimately, I think this is to make sure that as an organisation we continue to stay on track to deliver those objectives and outcomes that we've planned to do. So, you know, in the setting up of this webinar, we talked about a number of focus areas for business. These are sort of key business drivers at the moment, whether that is ensuring data, managing data privacy and protecting the data that you're handling. And obviously, many of us, I'm sure, are aware of all the new regulations, the GDPR, the Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA. I know California have just brought in some new consumer privacy laws at the turn of the year. So out there, there's a lot of pressure to make sure that we keep that data safe, and we only hold the data that we need. Why put ourselves at more risk than holding what we don't need? Can we work as an organisation more and more with partners and supply chains, and what does that mean in terms of the shared responsibilities for risk? And certainly 27001 recognises the benefits of working with suppliers, but it keeps bringing us back to the honesty of being, well, we are ultimately responsible for our own risk, even if others help us in mitigating those. But we need to make sure that is a right balance, and it is a challenge. And I think management system mechanisms like 27001, which includes in it one of the crucial processes of management review that I'm sure Gopal will talk a little bit about in his part, is that opportunity to make sure, are we getting the balance right between making sure that we're designing security into our products and services whilst continuing to make sure they're easy to use and accessible? Are we getting it right in terms of the efficiency of our business whilst using specialist suppliers? At the end of the day, if we do start to outsource things, is there a chance that we're going to take on a supplier's risk appetite, which we're kind of uncomfortable about because we signed up to some contractual obligations? And 27001 challenges you in all these areas to make sure you're clear as to what it means for you. So just sort of going back to a little bit of basics before I drill into a little bit of the detail of 27001. 31000 talks about putting in place a risk architecture. So doesn't mandate any particular way of doing it, doesn't mandate any particular tool, but it does suggest that if you want to have a good sound risk architecture, that you bear in mind three key components. That you've thought about the principles of risk management within your organisation. How well is it embedded within your organisation? Does everybody understand what the key risks for your organisations are, whatever their role is, from the top or the bottom of the organisation, all pulling together? Is it appropriately tailored? There are cultural factors that are in play if you've got a global organisation. Do you have to think about what that means? How is it understood across the world? Let's make sure it's systematic, repeatable, and visible to all those that have to have a role in making sure that it's effective. Because a more open system is open to challenge, but challenge is invariably a healthy thing, and make sure that as an organisation you're pulling together. In order to enact those principles, you need to put in place a framework. The framework includes the typical components of policies, making sure we know who's accountable for what, how it fits within the context of your organisation, whether you're in the telecommunications sector, whether you're in manufacturing, whether you're in finance sector. These are going to give different emphasis to what is important to you. How well is it being communicated around the organisation? Certainly, as an auditor, we go in there and we try and interview a wide range of people across the organisation, just to get that feel for how well do people understand, how effective is the communication, and we feed that back to the top management. Are we seeing any stresses, any issues in the resourcing of the risk treatment, and is that indicative perhaps of people not working in an integrated way, pulling together? And then lastly, but certainly not least, is really the engine room of the risk management, is the process, and I'll come back onto that in the detail in a moment. But essentially making sure we've identified those risks, we've analysed them, we've evaluated it, and we've put in place some form of treatment, and then we continue to challenge ourselves through review and measurement and monitoring, and use that as a way of going around the continual improvement cycle and continually responding to those internal and external factors. So what I think is a key, if we've only got a few minutes today, clearly all of the, I'm always going to argue that all aspects of 27001 are good to think about, but given the short time, focus in on clause 6. Whether you go for certification or not, focus in on clause 6. It beautifully lays out how you can approach risk and putting in place a good risk management process. Starts by challenging you to make sure what do you want to achieve, what are the key objectives, and how do they support your business. Objectives I tend to think of as something that's measurable, something that's tangible. Outcomes, something more perhaps behavioural. Are you seeing that everybody in the organisation understands how to report an incident or an event and helps you to understand what is going on out there? Why do you want to achieve these things? That really does help everyone to buy into it. You know, it's all very well telling people to do something. If they don't really understand why, then they're probably not going to be as committed as perhaps you would like to doing that thing that you're asking them to do. And have you identified everything that needs to be in the scope? We're certainly seeing more and more organisations come to us and say, we want the whole organisation to be covered by our 27001 certificate, and that's great because that recognises that it's no longer the responsibility or the domain of the IT departments. They just tend to provide the platform, the data storage capability, the connectivity, but the actual information value is known by the business owners, and sometimes they're the people that have to sign the checks if indeed some investment is needed to treat something or to improve something. And really making sure that you've got those leaders buy-in. At the end of the day, if they're not behind this, then you're going to struggle to drive it through the organisation. And part of that buy-in is making sure that you really understood what's the key criteria by which they're going to judge the risk. And I'd really encourage you to get that set up front. Don't try and sort of reverse engineer it. Don't try and fit it after the event when you've seen perhaps how good or bad your controls are. Try and just take a moment to step back and think about what your key risk criteria are, and engage with your leaders. How often do you want those risks to be reviewed? Because all organisations differ. Some are comfortable with an annual, some like a monthly review. Then the sort of second half, if you like, of clause 6 in 27001 is the formal process, running that system, getting that repeated drumbeat into your organisation, identifying those risks. Think about what is the impact. Is it an impact on a loss of confidentiality? Is it an impact on the loss of integrity of the data? Or is it an impact on the availability? And that does vary a lot from organisation to organisation, and it's certainly something I look for in terms of policy establishing that balance between those three drivers. I've mentioned the importance of the risk owners, and I will keep going on about that, because if they're not buying in, if they're not showing an interest, then things do start to break down a little. And you know, perhaps they're not really a great person for attending meetings. They send their deputies along, and you start as an auditor just to get that hint about how committed they are, and it's only going to come back to bite them. What is that likelihood of that risk coming to pass, and what is the impact? And this really starts to give you the chance to evaluate the risk, to prioritise those risks. There's always more to do than we've got time to do. So prioritisation is absolutely crucial in terms of getting the best return on your investment, and then start comparing those back to that criteria that I said that you need to set up earlier, because that really will help to set those priorities and get you on the best return for your investment. And what do you need to do by way of treating those risks? Perhaps you can continue as is. perhaps, things are okay in some areas, and those limited resources can just be focused on one or two areas for the next 12 months because you're reasonably comfortable that other things are protecting you in other areas. And finally, in terms of evaluation, don't start with Annex A. The standard really is quite strong on this. It asks you to compare those lists of treatments that you've identified with Annex A. It is that opportunity to ask yourself the question, have I missed anything? If you start with Annex A, the 100 or so controls and work back, there's a pretty good chance that you may have missed something. So I'd certainly strongly encourage you to think about what we want to do first and then use Annex A as that sort of checklist. And that gives you that risk treatment plan, gets you the risk owner's approval and buy-in, and off you go. So a few sort of tips, if you like, things I've picked up over the years, the do's and don'ts. Keep it as simple as possible. I do see a lot of complex systems out there. They're often, the enthusiasm of getting the system up and running in early days draws you into setting a complex process. In my experience, it never really lasts the first 3 years of the certification cycle. But that doesn't mean that it necessarily is a problem. People are learning, they're evolving, and but they do tend to move towards a simpler system because that does give you the regularity of the review. It does mean that the risk approach you're taking fits with your organisation, and make sure that those risk owners. It works really well if the risk owners are participating and active in looking at those risks and challenging those that are putting in place the risk treatment. Don't, as I say, start with the controls and work backwards. I would hope that any auditor worth their salt will recognise that and challenge you on whether you've missed. How do you know that you haven't missed it? And try and go back to basics. Just because you've always been doing something doesn't necessarily mean that it'll always work that way. And do make sure that you've got a good idea as to how you know whether those controls are effective or not. So I think that just leaves me to hand on to Gopal, who will talk to you a little about what he's done in Motorola.
Yep. Go ahead. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Chris and Rob, for setting this up. And so what I'll do, good day before that, good day to everyone on the call. What I'll do is I'm going to build on what Chris and Rob has talked about in terms of their information security management system. So what I'm going to be talking about is more on how do you implement the information security management system and actually implementing the ISO 27001. So a couple of things that I'll be going through would be kind of giving you a quick overview of the ISO 27001 clauses. And for this particular standard, they do have the controls that Rob just talked about, the 114 controls, that's Annex A, which is 27001-2. I'll talk about the structure of those controls. After I do the overview, I'll also talk about now how do you actually implement how do you implement the ISO 27001 system in your organization. And I'm going to share some of the lessons learned that we have done in Motorola and how do we simplify that and how do we make it success. Yeah. The next is we're going to talk about the steps to compliance. So we kind of also developed a methodology of, because Motorola has been a global organization and we need to not just one site that we need to get certified or complied to this standard. We need to get this across the globe. So we developed a what we call it a steps to compliance or certification, and I'll talk about that in a short while. And finally, I end up my presentation with the key challenges when you start to implement the ISO 27001 in your organization. All right, so with that, let me kind of go to the first slide here. So the structure of the ISO 27001, and I'm sure everyone on the call might be familiar with ISO standards. They usually come out with 10 clauses. 7 out of the 10 are auditable. What I have placed or structured it is show how these 7 clauses interact with each other. Now, what you will see in the outside triangle is I would say the infrastructure or the foundation that you need to have to build the inner 4 elements. And the outer 3 clauses is pretty much standard to all the other ISOs that your organization may have embraced, like the ISO 9000 or ISO 14000. So those are pretty similar. So the first clause is the context of the organization. It kind of defines the scope, and in this respective, in this particular ISO 27001, it's the information security scope that you need to define. And then clause 5 is leadership. Again, I will tell you from my experience that if you want to get any of the management systems implemented in an organization, if you do not have the man, I usually call it the man in the corner or the leader, engaged and committed to this program, don't waste your time. Move on, right? Because without them, you cannot get any success in implementing this program. So leadership is critical. So that's clause 5 kind of explains that. The next clause here, actually there's a typo here. It should be clause 7, which is support, which is the resources that you need to support the program or the management system. So those are the 3 key pillars or key foundation that you need to have to implement the system. Now, going in the middle, you'll see 4 clauses, which is 6, 8, clause 9, and 10. Clause 6 is the planning, which Rob just earlier talked a lot about it. So basically, planning talks about how do you want to define your information security systems in terms of assessing, and the heart of this entire 27001, I'll repeat this, is the risk management. Now, this standard is a very proactive standard, basically putting proactive controls to prevent any kind of exposure or cyber attack. It's not a reactive. So you need to do a lot of risk assessment and to identify where are your potential risks against the 3 key criteria, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information. So those are the key things. So they start planning for the necessary controls, then after which you implement or you execute those controls, and that's what we call operation, clause 8. And once you do both of that, then you need to make sure that you evaluate your performance, basically evaluate the effectiveness of the controls that you have put in place to mitigate the risk that you have identified in clause 6. So measure if the controls are meeting the controls objectives. Now, the clause 10 talks about improvement. Now, your measurement, obviously, whenever you measure, you have to have it measurement against a baseline or a goal. And if you're not meeting any of that, you need to put together action plans to bridge that gap. So that's called improvement, continuous improvement. And that's how you go. It kind of, so because it's plan, do, check, act. So that's how the ISO 27001 7 auditable clauses are structured. Now, to support this, and if you're familiar with all the other standards, like 9000 is pretty straightforward. It's just the 7 clauses. But particularly for the ISO 27001, it does come with annex, which actually gives you a guidance in terms of the controls that you need to implement to mitigate or treat the risk. And that comes in the annex, or it's ISO 27002. So that's basically the structure of the 27001 clauses. The next slide here is the controls. So now the controls, as I said, there are 114 controls, but they are structured into 35 security objectives, which comes within the 14 security domains. So you can see around the circle here, you can see the 14 domains, and within which there are subclauses, and within which you have all the controls. Now, the standard gives you guidelines in all the respective areas to go through and to sieve out which controls applies to the risk that you have identified in your organization, and then and gives you a guideline of how do you guideline of what controls that you need to put in place to mitigate that risk. So this is how it's structured. So I've done the clauses and I've done the controls. Right. So what we did at Motorola was once we went through this, and we wanted to implement this across the organization. Now, if I were to bring this to the people who are actually running the IT operations or the service operations, it's going to be overwhelming for them to understand this. So what my team did is we kind of boiled both these clauses and controls into what we call a 8-step approach to structuring the information security management system. And this is really here a Motorola approach of doing it. So the first thing is, in anything that you want to do, you got to define the boundaries. And the step one is to define the scope. And once you define, okay, this is the organization, or this is the boundary where I want to implement this management system or the information security management system, then you say, okay, this is the scope. And then within that scope, you have to define information assets. This is very, very important step, because once, if otherwise, what risk are you going to be assessing? Exactly where are you going to be assessing the risk against? So you got to define the information assets, and once you have, and make sure that they are complete within that scope that you have defined. Now, once you have identified all of those assets, then the step 2 is to then risk assess each of these information assets against the 3 criteria: the confidentiality. I always call that CIA: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Look at the risk against the 3 criteria for each of these information assets. Now, once you have done the assessment, then you treat the risk, and this is where the controls come about. Like what Chris said, in some instances, the risk, obviously you need to have this risk tolerance. And once, if it is below the risk tolerance, and you can accept the risk and move on. Otherwise, you need to treat the risk. And you treat the risk by implementing controls that will ensure that it will bring the risk lower than your load tolerance. And the controls is where you go to the, like I said, Annex A. There is 114 controls over there. You're going to determine which controls out of the 114 that you need to pick up to apply to address the risk that you have identified in step 2. So risk treatment is step 3. Then you move on to step 4, which is the statement of applicability, which is basically to ensure that you have not missed out any of those controls. So you go through the 114 controls to make sure that you have at least picked up the right ones. And even if you have not picked up any one of that, you need to justify that this is the reason why you have not picked up that particular control. Once you have done all of that, this is the planning stage. So 1 to 4 is kind of now you have done the risk assessment, you have treated the risk with the controls. So this is the plan. Now, once you have done that, then the next step is to implement the controls. Implement the controls and make sure that everyone is aware and understand what is the objective of those controls. So everyone who is operating those controls know that we know how to meet those objectives. Now, once that is done, then the next step is to make sure that you audit for effectiveness. Now, when you implement the control, doesn't mean it is a done deal. You have to make sure that the controls is doing its job. So making sure that it's effective. Now, how do you determine effectiveness? Obviously, you need to have a goal. Okay, so for every controls that you put in there, you have to set up a goal. And once you have a goal, you measure, put a matrix and see if it's meeting the goal. If it is meeting the goal, fine, that's good. Move on, keep meeting the goal. If it is not, then develop some an action plan to address the gap and implement them. And once that's done, you have a management review to make sure that you have implemented all of the controls and that you have a structured information security management system. So that's basically the 8 steps in terms of structuring the system. So this is how we went, and it helped us a lot in terms of educating the entire organization and trying to bring in a structured approach in bringing the ISO 27001 to the various organizations. Now, the next slide here I'm going to talk about is, I mentioned earlier in terms of the steps to certification or compliance. Now, just after structuring, it does not mean that they are compliant to the standard or are ready to be certified. So what we developed is a couple of steps to make sure that every organization, if they want to go and get themselves compliant to the standard, they have to go through these steps. And the first step is obviously training. They need to understand what they need to do. So my team actually went out and got external training and came back and developed some internal training and ensure that we standardize those training and make sure that everyone in the organization who is going to be going for compliance to be trained in this standard. After they are trained, we have a gap analysis or a baseline assessment where they are in terms of the ISMS. And once we do a self-assessment or having a baseline, then we know exactly what is the gap to reach compliance, and we start doing getting action plans to implement and address those gaps. So once an organization is ready, that they have completed all of the actions to bridge the gap, and they think they have met all the requirements, then we do a level 2 audit. Now, what is a level 2 audit? A level 2 audit is a externally certified, like myself, I'm an externally certified auditor for ISO 27001, but I'm not part of a registrar, but I am a certified auditor. So I come in and actually do a formal audit on that organization and provide them a findings in the similar way as a registrar does. The NCs, the major, minor, and an OFI. We provide them that findings statement. So once with that statement report is presented to the organization, they address all of those and implement all the necessary controls and bridge the gap. Then we go back and review that they have appropriately closed all of those findings. And they are all good. Then we do a management review and we give them a compliance status. Now, that's meaning that the site is compliant to the standard, not certified. Now, in Motorola, what we have decided is compliance is good enough unless there is a business or a customer requirement to get certification. Because the difference between certification and compliance is very simple. It's paying registrar like LRQA or BSI or any of those registrars out there to come and certify us. So unless there is a business requirement or a customer requirement, we bring that organization to certification. So that's the steps that we have here. All right, so the last slide here, I have some of the challenges that we've saw while we did this when we started to embrace the ISO 27001. The key, and the first one up here is senior leadership commitment and engagement. Like I said earlier, if you don't have this, it's not going to work. So it's very important that you have the senior constant, not just a one-time, they should be constantly engaged and informed on how we are progressing it, and that's what the management review does. The second thing is the complete information asset determination. Now, when I said in the very beginning, once you determine the scope, you have to identify the information assets. So make sure that it's complete and accurate. Next is the effective controls implementation and measurement. So once you have identified the controls and you implement, you have to make sure that it's effectively implemented. Next is the closed loop continual improvement, pretty straightforward. Another thing is the risk assessment. So risk assessment is not a one-time thing. It should be a continual. So the risk can continually change as the environment changes or people changes, organization changes. A lot of things can impact the risk. So you got to continually assess the risk. Lastly, awareness. A lot of organizations fail in this thing is because the awareness of the information security is not there. And I like to end this presentation by saying that information security is everyone's responsibility. It's not just an exclusive group of people that needs to manage information security. It's everybody's responsibility. Right. So with that, I know I'm taking up a lot of time. I'm sure that's going to be a lot of questions. So with that, I'll hand it back to Dan.
Gopal Krishnan, thank you very much for your presentation. And you actually ended on a great point there, talking about everyone's responsibility. We've got about 5 minutes or so left. There's the details if you do want to reach the Lloyd's Register team. Obviously, Rob as our speaker today. And there's the number and obviously the email address should you need that. We're going to just push quickly on because I want to get that. Now, I have actually started this poll about 5 minutes ago just because I've just come to the time. I wanted to make sure we got some people voting on this. But yeah, Gopal Krishnan just sort of finished up there saying about everyone's responsibility. But who is your organisation's risk owners is this third and final poll question. So this has been running since about for about 5-6 minutes now. So yeah, the options are IT, business managers, other or uncertain. We'll run that up until the end. Just going to bring up the results of the second poll. Sorry, that one is running. The second poll we asked you was just after Chris's opening there about obviously various threat landscape, and we asked, would you know if your company has had a cyber attack? 57% of you said yes, 31% uncertain, 10% said no. So pretty good that most of you have got that sort of level of visibility. Right, let's just quickly move on then. We have, so we're a little up on time, but I do want to get a couple, we did get one question in, Gopal, which I'm going to push straight over to you, and because it was actually regarding your slide 25, which was the 8-step slide you referred to. Thankfully, it did have a number in the bottom right corner, so thanks very much to the person who asked this question, because it actually made me know that you were talking about you. It said it refers to asset-based risk assessment. Does ISO 27001:2013 allow this approach? Are you able to take that one?
Yep, sure. Yes, the answer is yes. When I said asset-based risk assessment, it's talking about the assessment, the risk assessment against the information assets. Once you have defined the information assets, you need to ensure that you have, if you familiar with the standard, there is an SOA, and we have a very structured approach that talks about all of the information assets and the risk assessment in relation to each of these information assets. And that is something that you need to build to be presented to the, if you want to go for certification, the external auditor. And another thing I want to add to, that is really important because that SOA has to be version controlled. And whenever after you have gone through the registrar's audit, you will be presented with a certificate in relation to the SOA version number. It will be explicitly stated in the certificate that you are certified in accordance to the SOA version 7 or version 10. So it's very important that you have to do it, and the answer is yes.
Awesome, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for the question. Just before we go to Rob, just one quick question for you, Gopal, again. In terms of getting ISO 27001, is it quite, nothing's easy in this world, let's be completely honest. In comparison to, say, compliance, things like that, how do you put this on a sort of scale of actual achievement? Is it something you think that comes with having a good security risk posture, or is it something you think that actually, needs a kind of firm commitment?
Both. Then it's both. Yeah, it starts with the commitment. It's not actually ISO 27. I've been familiar with a lot of standards, 29,000, 20,000, 14,000, 18,000, but 27,001 is, I would say, amongst all of them, is a bit the most difficult one, or a bit more complex because it involves the controls. And the first thing is commitment. coming from the leadership. The second very important thing in the ISO 27001 is the risk management system. So I would recommend any organization who wants to go for the 27001. A precursor to that is to ensure that you have a very good structured risk management program. There is an ISO 30 standard, which is ISO 31000, that gives you a guideline. It's not an auditable standard, but it gives you a guideline. Make sure that you have that risk management program in place before you go into the 27001. I hope I've answered your question then.
Yeah, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for sending that. Rob, we've got two questions. I'm going to kind of roll these into one. Someone said, can you explain the benefits of ISO 27001 certification? I think we've kind of covered that. I guess, it's a good one to show to your customers, your business, etc. But I'm just going to roll that one. Also, another question had, could an individual get a certificate for ISO 27001? I think as opposed to doing it as a company. So if you were like a one-man band, for example. So Rob, I don't know if you could sort of take both. First of all, could you get a certificate for a person? Let's say me, I'm setting up my own business tomorrow, and could I go and get one? And secondly, what do you think let's say maybe the sort of the main benefit as you see it from the certification?
Okay, thanks, Dan. So I think in terms of individual certification, yes, all ISOs are scalable. So whether it's a one-person or a 1,000-person organisation, perhaps a little bit of a challenge to show independent audit of yourself. So you probably need to, in a one-man organisation, employ a third party. If you want it as a career boosting, probably it's more about getting the sort of qualification that Gopal was talking about, becoming a lead auditor for 27001. We need more and more auditors for 27001. It's a great career opportunity to get to see behind the scenes. So I'd always encourage people to go for that sort of lead auditor qualification. In terms of benefits, yep, we've talked about some of those. I think, as Chris perhaps said, that more and more we're seeing big organisations rippling it down the supply chain. If you want to be part of a supply chain, typically we see more and more requirement for certification. But the benefits in terms of unplanned cost. I mean, the cost. Chris, talked about the sorts of incidents that happen, and those costs can be quite exorbitant, both in terms of compensating your customer base as well as internal investment. And so, I guess we've got to come back to the money, but also reputation. If you've got 27001, you have positively said to the world out there, look, we're so confident about our process that we're going to bring an independent body in and show them all about it. And we see that as a very positive thing. And it means that you can be positive about what you do without necessarily exposing all that you do. Clearly it's a sensitive environment, but you can employ an independent body to come in and say, yep, they're doing the right thing, and that can be a positive message to put out to the market.
And can I add on to Rob? And from our experience in Motorola, when we're going out for new businesses, the new customers are actually in the RFQ are asking us, do we have such a program? More and more customers are asking that. So you have a competitive edge. And in one instance in Denmark, where they were going for a tender, and the tender requested the companies to have a 27001 certificate. So if you do have a certification like that, you have a competitive edge out there too. So just wanted to add on to what Rob was saying there.
No problem at all. Thanks very much. Thanks for stepping in. I'm just going to just one more question, just come conscious of time. We'll put this last one to Chris. We've just had a question in. What are good conversations to talk to the leadership team in order to get senior management buyout? Chris, you obviously detailed some of the threats. You detailed some of the breaches, various instances. Is that a good tactic to go to and sort of say, look, this is what could happen? Is that one tactic you'd try? You'd recommend trying anyway?
Yeah, I mean, we've had success with that sort of approach for a number of years now. If the senior management ultimately understand that it's their responsibility, and that if things go wrong, that it's that team that's going to be asked questions, that can get them to sit up and listen a little bit. You can go the scare tactics route, look at these other breaches that have happened, look at the reputational hit, look at the dollar amount, all that sort of stuff. And you can go the sort of compassionate route as well. These are real people's lives that are involved. It's not just data, it's personal information. And, you should have a duty of care for the information that you're storing and processing. And if none of that works, there's a number of recent breaches that have resulted in real stock price drops for publicly traded organisations. So, if nothing else, people do tend to care about the money.
Yeah, I think money is always what it comes down to. So, speaking of the money, we have taken up a lot of your time today, so huge thanks to all of you for sticking with us today. Really good numbers today. Thank you very much for joining us for what I hope has been a really engaging webinar. I've certainly learned a lot today, and I'm going to probably go back and, ask a question back to point up, actually, get back and listen to this again at some point, because if you do want to listen to this webinar all over again, we're going to be, this will be available on demand in about sort of 10-15 minutes, so if you want to listen all over again, then please do. As we wrap up, big thanks again to Lloyd Register for their sponsorship today, and to Gopal Krishnan, to Rob and to Chris, our speakers today. If you're looking for more information on other subjects, there's a whole catalogue of info security webinars in our library. You can go back about 3 or 4 years, find all sorts of stuff. The next one coming up though is next Thursday, the 20th of February, and that is on the subject of automation in data file transfer, and that is at 3 p.m. GMT, 10 a.m. Eastern, so slightly earlier than we were today. Also, just to update the diary, the next online summit takes place on the 25th and 26th of March. We're currently working hard on that, and there's going to be sessions there on various subjects, including ransomware, fraud, 2 different subjects there, by the way, though they can come into the same thing, security, hygiene, IoT, and also be looking at our point counterpoint that we do in our print mag. We're doing those live, actually, some live debates on a couple of subjects. So do sign up for that. You can get to that via the homepage. And again, a recording will be available soon. So on your way out, please do rate the webinar and let us know what you thought for today's webinar. And I forgot to wrap up the third and final poll, so I'm going to do that before I end it. And that is, who are your organisation's risk owners? You said the business managers with 56%, 19 for IT, 15 other, and 8 for uncertain. So with that, big thanks to all of you again. Thanks again to Lloyd's Register, and we'll see you next time.